Okay, so, all right, so we've gotten through some of it. Started into the vertebrates, and these two groups here, okay, these aren't vertebrates, the hagfish. You just need to know them by their common name. You don't need a scientific name for them. There's not too many species of them, very few. Just what you know that they exist, and that the hagfish, both of these are marine, but the hagfish, they only have cranium. They still have the dorsal hollow nerve cord, but that nerve cord is not in any sort of protective sheath of any sort. It doesn't have the vertebrae. But we have vertebrae then in the vertebrata from here on, although even in lampreys, the skeletal, axial skeletal parts, cranium and vertebrae are not bone. Okay, it is cartilage, okay, which is a softer material, which we'll talk about once we get into physiology. And so now in the early Paleozoic, there are these forms that seem to be related to lampreys. Okay, exactly the relationship is not so certain, but still they had cartilage, but they also had what's called dermal bone. Okay, this is not derived, so they are mineralized plates. But most of the skeleton, when we get further down the road here, is derived from mesodermal tissues, or tissues of mesodermal origin. But this is a little bit different. This is from ectoderm. Okay, so it's actually developed bone from the epidermis. So they did have these sort of shields on them. They didn't have jaws. They were probably detritus feeders from everything that we can see. Detritus means decaying organic material. So they were sweeping it up from the bottom. This group is often called ostracoderms. And those ostracoderms are, it's probably paraphyletic, okay? And as far as the, which one of these is more closely related to the Gnathostomata is not really all that well understood at the present moment, okay? Although their skeletons were still cartilage. All right, so our next big group, which encompasses a vast majority of vertebrates, is the Gnathostomata. And apomorphies here is that they have hinged jaws. All the other things that we're looking at have no such thing. So this is an evolutionary novelty, having jaws. Furthermore, instead of just only having a dorsal fin, they now have paired pectoral and pelvic fins, which will later become legs in the terrestrial vertebrates. Furthermore, mineralized axial skeleton. So when I'm talking about the axial skeleton, it's the skull backbone. Okay, that is now mineralized, and it's made out of grains of calcium phosphate. Right? So so we have three different apomorphies here for this particular group. Now, where this jaws came from is that they developed. We have good evidence, embryological as well as fossil evidence, that suggests that the jaws came from gill supports. Okay, remember one apomorphy of hemichordata plus chordata is having pharyngeal slits. And those pharyngeal slits still have to have some sort of skeletal support. Okay, so there's later these have developed into gills, gill arches, and the anterior-most gill arch have become, in fact, the first two up here have migrated forward, become hinged, and this is where the jaws actually have evolved from. At least that's what we believe. You don't need to understand what this hyomandibular bones happen to be. Just only the take-home message here is that from the pharyngeal supports, bone supports, these is where the jaws happen to come from. Okay, so, and another fossil group from the Devonian and on called placoderms. Once again, they were pretty abundant in ancient Paleozoic seas. Okay, and this is a figure from your textbook of an early gnathostome, jawed fish. And please notice the scale there. That is 1/2 meter, okay, like that. Okay, so this is a pretty big fish. Probably jaws evolved in response to predation, okay, in order to catch food, prey. So these are the gnathostomes. So going up the gnathostomes, one of the first groups that leaves off here is chondrichthyes. Chondrichthyes, CTH. Start that over again. Chondrichthyes, okay. Chondrichthyes, these are sharks and rays. That's the ones that we have surviving today. And apomorphy is that the skin has these sort of tooth-like hard substances in it that makes it feel like sandpaper. So when you dissect a shark after spring break, you can feel the skin and you'll feel these denticles. And they're made out of a very hard substance related to enamel. Like your teeth are made out of enamel, but this is called enameloid. And so that's one apomorphy I'll put there. And then in the males, they have what are called pelvic claspers. This is sort of unique to the sharks and rays as well. The females don't have them. And when we do this, when you look at the shark in the lab, you'll see these pelvic claspers. They're used for holding on to the female because here, even though they are aquatic, that still fertilization is internal. So they do mate, and this is what the males will hold on to the females with. It's pelvic claspers. No, this is not an apomorphy because it's widespread in many other aquatic gnathostomes, but it's a sensory system that they are sensitive to changes in pressure. Okay, so if something moves in the water, it creates pressure waves. And this can be picked up by this lateral line system. Other types of fish have it as well. So it is a tube that's going down the sides of the body under the epidermis, and it's filled with a pressure-sensitive fluid. And so when pressure waves hit it, and of course it's innervated, then it sends a message to the brain. And it's so accurate that they, just from pressure, they can tell what direction and origin of the pressure waves came from. And so they can orient themselves either toward it or away from it. So a lot of fish have this type of system. Okay, cartilaginous skeleton. Isn't that interesting? Because here we have bone. That was an apomorphy, mineralized axioskeleton. That was an apomorphy for Gnathostomata. So how come, why cartilaginous? Obviously, it's a secondary reversal. So they have lost mineralization. And you can put that down as a apomorphy too, because they came from an ancestry with bone. And in fact, some sharks still have a little bit of bony skeleton. Here and there, indicating that that was the ancestral condition. But for the most part, their skeletons have been demineralized. And why can I say that? Wouldn't it be more parsimonious, since the chondrichthyes are here, all these guys up here have mineralized skeletons, why don't I put this apomorphy here? These are cartilaginous, these are cartilaginous, and these have bone.
You have jaws?
Because of those placoderms that I talked about. They were basal gnathostomes. They belong here before this, and they had bone. Okay, so bone actually arose in the Gnathostomata. The placoderms had bony skeletons, and the rest of these have bony skeletons, and so the most parsimonious explanation is that these have lost it. Furthermore, there's evidence that they have lost it because, as I said, some sharks do have some mineralized axial skeleton. Okay, so these won't bother with them anymore. Oh yeah, and the heart, two-chambered heart. Now, actually, the heart in gnathostomes has 4 chambers, but your textbook concentrates on 2 particular types of chambers in the vertebrate heart, namely something called an atrium and a ventricle. Now, there's 2 other things that almost no one ever mentions, simply because a lot of the writers of your textbooks are mammalian biased. Okay, they don't really look at reptiles and fish, and actually there's 4 chambers to this heart, 2 of which are never found in mammals. Okay, but here when they're talking about chambers of the heart, your book, we're concentrating just on atrium and ventricles, not anything else. And so these guys, with regard to atrium, you have 1 atrium, 1 ventricle, and we'll, when we get into physiology, we'll talk more about how these operate. Okay, so all the rest now of clade here are osteichthyes, which in Greek means bony fish. Okay, this includes us. We're also belong to that clade. We're not fish, all right? But this is an old name. Once the name gets put in there, we sort of, once we understand the evolution and the phylogenetic relationships better, we still keep the same name, okay? We still are derived from this, all right? So osteichthyes, apomorphies for this particular group, okay? Of course, they do have bony endoskeleton, all right? But they have some sort of lungs or lung derivatives. Now, fish with lungs, we do believe that that is the ancestral condition. And in a lot of fishes, they have lost lungs, or they have become detached from the respiratory system, and they now serve as swim bladders, okay? Where lungs came from originated from outpocketings of the esophagus, okay? So you have your mouth, and then an area called the pharynx, and then there is the esophagus, it's you, and then the stomach. So these have developed as outpocketings of the esophagus. And then we can sort of see that because through our nose, mouth, pharynx, it's a common passageway for both food and air. And it isn't until you get to a branch point where off of the end of the pharynx, we have the trachea that takes the air to the lungs. Okay, so these are outpocketings. Now, what happens in some fishes is that these have broken off and have become something called a swim bladder. And the swim bladder's function is to fill with air or deflate it in order to keep themselves buoyant in the water, because they're still pulled down by gravity, and by filling up the, and if they didn't have a swim bladder, they'd have to constantly swim to keep from sinking down. And that takes a lot of energy. And so by having a swim bladder, they can be buoyant, fill it up with gas, and stay at a certain level in the ocean without sinking due to gravity. Okay, but nonetheless, lungs or lung derivatives found in the osteichthyes. One of the biggest group of osteichthyes is Actinopterygii. Actinopterygii, and these are called gray fin fishes. This is the biggest group of vertebrates altogether. There's more species of these than terrestrial vertebrates or any of the chordates. It's a very species-rich group. So these are called ray fin fishes. These are examples of various types of ray fin fishes. So most of the fishes that you're familiar with, tuna and salmon and catfish, perch, all these happen to belong to Actinopterygii. The only apomorphy I'm going to give for them is that they have their fins, their pectoral fins, and the pelvic fins are supported by straight rods of cartilage that are called lepidoltrichium. So in the fins, which keeps the fins hanging out there, is these cartilaginous rods, and this is lepidoltrichium. And then, furthermore, it's not an apomorphy, but in order to protect the gills, because the gills are right in this area, the gills are in the pharynx part, is that they have a flap up here. This, you can't see it too well, but right here is a flap of ectodermal origin that overlies the gills and allows water to be moved through the mouth, over the gills, and out this part. This is called an operculum. And an operculum is sort of protective, but it also has functions in how they move water across their gills. And when we get into physiology, we'll talk about that as well. Okay, I already mentioned that the main function of swim bladders happens to be for keeping buoyancy. But there's still some fish that still breathe air. They do both. They have gills, they can get water, oxygen out of the gills, but they also come to the surface and engulf air. It's not as efficient as terrestrial vertebrates, but it does supplement their oxygen supply. And then the next clade is Sarcopterygii. These are lobe fin fishes. Okay, so this group, the apomorphy is that the base of the pelvic and pectoral fins are reinforced by bone. Okay, in Actinopterygii, this happens to be just cartilage, rods, but these are articulated bone, and they have the same arrangement as bone in our, we'll come to this in a moment. Let me just jump ahead here. Same arrangement of bone as what we have in our arms and legs. Okay, there's one bone up here that corresponds to our humerus, it's in our arm, or our femur, it's down here. Two bones from the elbow down to the wrist, and then several phalanges. So these bony supports are present in these lobe fishes. And they were much more species rich in the past than we have today. Today there's only very few of them left. One group is called the Actinista. You just need to know them as coelacanths. And for this group, I'm going to put them up here as a tritomy. That's an A. Okay. Coelacanths. We believe that this particular group of fish had died out in the Mesozoic, okay, because it's a fossil-rich group, but sometime in the 1950s, a fisherman in the Indian Ocean caught one of these things, and since then, there have been at least two others. They're really, really rare. They're usually found real deep in the ocean, but still, they have the same bony supports for the pectoral and pelvic fins. Dipnoid, this is lungfish. There's only 6 species of them left. They have a real rich fossil history. They once were far more abundant than what they are today. These actually have lungs, and can breathe air. They can walk on land, okay, with their fins. They don't walk very far, but usually they live, right now they're confined to just South America and Australia. And when the puddle that they, or the pond that they happen to live in dries up, they will encase themselves in dry mud, and their metabolic rates will go way down, and during that time they're breathing air. And in fact, if you put them in water and keep them in water, they will drown, even though they're fish, okay? And these guys sometimes can even be found up in trees. They will climb trees, right? And they seem, this group here, even though I'm putting this as a tritomie for the coelacanths, lungfish, the tetrapods, terrestrial vertebrates, really this group here is more closely related. But I'm not going to give any sort of apomorphism to them. Just want you to know that they exist and that they're very closely related to our next group, the tetrapods. Getting back to this, this is the ancient sarcopterygian fish from the late Permian. We have a series of fossils that become more and more tetrapod-like. You don't need to know this Eusthenopteron. Don't need to know its name. I just have it up there showing it as an example of a fish that has this bony structure very much like the bones in our arms and in our legs. So tetrapoda. This is several apomorphies here. The fins, they're derived from lobe fin ancestry, obviously, but these are now function as legs instead of fins. They are terrestrial. Furthermore, leaving the water created a problem. In water, at least, there's a little bit of buoyancy because the density of water could hold the body up a little bit. But once you get on land, then gravity is pulling the body down, and that creates problems. So these pelvic girdle, and also there's a pectoral girdle up here. We're talking about girdles. It's the attachment of the legs to the backbone. Now, in the sarcopterygian fishes down here, the lungfish and coelacanth, those bones are not attached and supported at the backbone. Here they are. Once again, same types of bones here. Femur, this is in the leg. One bone corresponds to humerus in our arm, fibula, tibia, and then a number of tarsals, and then phalanges. The number of phalanges in the earliest tetrapods varied from something like 8 to 3. Later on, it settled down to 5, and that is the major pattern that we have in later tetrapods. Remember Tiktaalik? Okay, this here happens to be an intermediate between something that's like dipnoid and tetrapod. They have intermediate characteristics in that they did have all these bones in fins. Also, those bones were attached to the backbone, but it still had fins. It didn't have legs. It was still fish, but it had a lot of intermediate characteristics similar to tetrapods. Okay, tetrapods, when they're adults, no longer have gills. Okay, even though in the embryos of all tetrapods, they still develop the pharyngeal slits that normally would become gills. So they breathe exclusively by lungs, and it's a little bit more efficient than the lungs are a little more efficient than what you find in fish. Furthermore, there's a joint between the head and the rest of the body called a neck. Fish don't have necks. Okay, they don't have that flexible part that can move the head in different directions. That's another apomorphy for tetrapods. Okay, so that's the tetrapoda. So tetrapods are the first groups. amphibians. Okay, they're still very much tied to watery environments. They have to go back to the water in order to reproduce. Although the adults are terrestrial, their larvae and young are not. I'm going to just give, these are somewhat, the modern amphibians that we have today are somewhat specialized. They have a lot of apomorphies of their own. I'm just going to mention something here, namely the way in which their teeth is embedded in their bone. These are types of teeth that are called penicillate teeth, and that seems to be unique to this particular group. Furthermore, in the ear, they have an extra bone. It's called an auricular operculum, and so this is just only another bone that's in the middle ear that helps detect sound, and that's unique to them as well. So all their larvae, once they hatch from eggs, they breathe by means of gills. They are aqueous, and then they undergo a transformation called metamorphosis, in which for example, the frogs, their tadpoles, the tail is completely reabsorbed, the gills disappear, and then they change into the adult form that happens to breathe by means of a lung. However, their lungs are not very efficient. It's almost just like an open sac. So from the trachea, then the lung is just only an open space like this. It doesn't have a lot of folds. Some of them have some folding, but there's not a lot of surface area there for the absorption of oxygen. And therefore, their skin is also a respiratory organ. So in order for them to use the skin as a respiratory organ, it has to stay moist, because oxygen, which is in a gas form, first of all has to dissolve in a layer of water before it can be brought into any of the epithelial cells that happen to be on the skin, and then into the bloodstream. In fact, there are some species of frogs that they only breathe by means of their skin. They don't have lungs at all. They've lost them. And these are in the Amazon forest, where it's nice and moist, but the skin is highly, highly folded. They're sort of ugly looking things, but they have very highly folded skin, and the whole function of those folds is the increased surface area, okay? And this is another thing that limits and keeps this group of organisms in wet habitats. Because if the skin dries out, they suffocate. Okay, I already mentioned undergo metamorphosis, and of course they do have a bony skeleton. They are, after all, belonging to the osteoichthyes, or the Nathostomata. And that's all we're going to say about amphibians. Oh yeah, the heart is a little more sophisticated. It now has 3 chambers. So there's one ventricle and 2 atria. And as I said, when we get into circulatory system, we're going to be comparing vertebrate circulatory systems, and we'll look at these hearts. Okay, now the real big group of tetrapods. Which are more adapted to terrestrial conditions. This is the amniotic. And so this involves 2 major groups: reptiles, which are including birds, reptiles and birds, and then a lineage that goes to mammals. We have a lot of members of this group that existed during the Mesozoic that are now extinct. The major apomorphy here is amniotic egg. Okay? In frogs and fishes, amphibians and fishes, when you have an egg, sperm, fertilization, zygote, it'll eventually cleave into a blastula, blastula into a gastrula, and so forth. But nonetheless, every cell in the body was derived from that zygote. This here is a little bit different. When, with the amniotic egg, the zygote will indeed undergo cleavage, forming a morula, a blastula, a gastrula, and so forth. But not all of the cells in that blastula will become part of the future animal. It produces some of those cells will become what are called extra-embryonic membranes. They're genetically identical to the gene content of the cells that become the animal, but nonetheless, these are never part of the animal. They have other functions. In fact, there's 3 different tissues here. Extra-embryonic tissues, the amnion, and this forms a bag that is filled with fluid so that the embryo is still just like in any fish or in any amphibian, it is developing in an aqueous environment. So that is called amniotic fluid, and so it is being nourished by this amniotic fluid. It also cushions it a little bit and prevents dehydration. The allantois, it's mostly for waste disposal. Now, usually the major type of waste is nitrogenous from the breakdown of proteins. We produce ammonia. Ammonia is highly toxic, okay? So the amine groups of proteins cleaved off, it forms ammonia, and that's not a problem for anything that's developing in water. Because ammonia is very, very soluble. It just diffuses away into the pond or into the river or into the ocean. But this here is laid on land, and this embryo cannot jump out of the egg, run behind the bush and take a pee. It has to stay in the egg, and that waste will build up and eventually kill it. So the allantois is another membranous sac in which all that different waste material is placed so that it is out of the way from the embryo. It's also involved a little bit in respiration because they still have to take in oxygen. And then another layer that oftentimes is mineralized, especially in some reptiles, but not all. In some reptiles it's mineralized, and this is called the chorion. The chorion is very much involved in gas exchange. Getting rid of carbon dioxide, taking in oxygen. Now, when you have gas exchange, there's also a problem of water loss. And this thing has its own little seed buried inside of it, and it can easily dehydrate, okay? Except for this chorion is so evolved that it can allow gas exchange with a minimal amount of water loss. Yes, it's going to fry if you put it out in the sun. So, but still, this is on land. It's not in contact with ocean or anything like that. Yeah.
So because it's creating the extra embryonic layers, that's going to come after the vascular, right? So first you're going to
Yeah. So these extra embryonic, good question. When do these extra embryonic layers start to form? It's later in the gastrula stage. They will form.
So it's basically going to create its own protection by forming the layers.
Yeah. These layers will grow around the developing embryo. And when it comes to human reproduction later on in physiology, I'll come back to this. Okay, so this is the main, furthermore, waterproof skin. Okay, waterproof skin. How do they make waterproof skin? It's because the skin has layers of a protein called keratin. Okay, keratin is a structural protein, and and this is another adaptation to drier conditions, terrestrial conditions. Now, that creates a physiological problem, however. If you make your skin waterproof, well, in the amphibians down here, they use their skin for gas exchange. Now they can't use the skin for gas exchange. If it's waterproof, it's also can't move oxygen across it very easily. Therefore, the lungs have become more efficient. Okay, there's greater surface area inside of the lungs. Amphibians have what are called unicameral lungs. It just looks like a balloon on the inside. But in many amniotes, these are highly folded on the inside. called multicameral. And all these folds create a large surface area for gas exchange. Furthermore, these have to be ventilated. Now, what I mean by ventilation is you have to use muscular force, some energy to move gases into and out of the lung. It just doesn't go by diffusion. And so the ventilation system here now uses ribs. So we have ribs off the backbone, muscles that will extend the ribs outward, which increases the volume of the thoracic cavity so that air will move in, because you're lowering the pressure and it moves in, and then the ribs collapse, pushing the air back out. In amphibians, they basically, they don't have ribs to do this. And in the amphibians, what they end up doing is basically swallowing air. So it's the bottom of their buccal cavity that's used to move air in and out. So this is what a frog skeleton looks like. No ribs. Whereas in the amniotes, they have ribs. One of the problems, though, with the amniotes is that they can't use their ribs to breathe and walk at the same time. They interfere with each other. And we'll see that that problem gets solved in another group of organisms that we come to. Okay, amniotes. So the amniotes arrive in the late Paleozoic, and there's two major branches to this group. One called Sauropsida, another called Synapsida. Okay, I'll talk about the synapsid clade, and then I'm going to return to this as well. Because during the Permian, which was the last period of the Paleozoic, this was the major terrestrial vertebrate group, synapsids. At the end of the Permian, we had mass extinction. I already talked about the Permian crisis. And most of the synapsids were really wiped out. So that it was the other branch, the Sauropsids, that then in the Mesozoic took over the terrestrial habitat, and synapsids stayed very low until the end of the Mesozoic. So these happen to be, these are not dinosaurs. These are not even close to being dinosaurs. I'm sorry if this is going to destroy your childhood education, but these are nowhere close to dinosaurs. But they're early synapsids. And incidentally, we are synapsids. These things are more closely related to us than they are to dinosaurs. Okay, so they usually went extinct at the end of the Permian. Now, what is the major apomorphy of these is that, in the skull, early skulls of both amphibians, Paleozoic fish, and amniotes have certain bones, and we can identify all those bones, and I'm not going to have you learn all these bones. However, the primitive form of the skull, a lot of these skull bones are not the original cranium. Remember I mentioned crania down here? That was cartilage, structure of cartilage that is around the skull. Most of these bones later developed, these are skulls, they're dermal bone. So they're not of mesodermal origin. They're ectodermal for the most part. And they have formed from the skin and forming hard plates all around here. And as we go through the evolution of amniotes, some of these bones will fuse, etc. Early on, it was a skull that was completely covered with bone, except for the eye, where the eyes happen to be. So what later developed are these openings behind the eye, which are called temporal fenestra. Fenestra is that word is from Italian, and it means window. And so this is sort of an opening in the skull, the function of which is, in some cases, not so clear, but it could serve two different functions. One, it decreases the weight of the skull, because these animals are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And secondly, it provides more attachment sites for muscles that operate the jaws. Okay, so these are called temporal fenestra because the area behind the eye is called, even in our school, this is the temporal region. Okay, and this particular group has one temporal fenestra in contrast to the next group that I'll talk about. Furthermore, they have their teeth embedded in the jawbone in cusps. Okay, so it's sort of a socket-like.
Why did you mention animal size in relation to fenestra?
Well, because as animals get bigger, 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 you have all this bony skull, it's going to get heavier, 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 and it's going to be hard to hold up. And so by decreasing the bone content of the skull and replacing it with just open space, you know, it makes it lighter. Okay, okay. So this type of skull is called anapsid. That word should come up. In fact, it should come up here. I think I have it up here. No, I don't. Okay, I'll write it up here. Anapsid. So an anapsid type of skull. So teeth with embedded in cusps into the bone, and also the teeth differentiation. You look at the teeth of a frog or teeth of a fish, they all look alike, okay? And even in many reptiles, the teeth all look alike. They have pretty much the same form. But one thing that they have in these early synapsids is teeth differentiation. It's called heterodonty. You don't need to know that word, but they have one prominent thing they have are canine teeth. These are always along, okay? I already mentioned that in the lineage leading to humans, after humans and the great apes split, is a reduction in canine teeth, okay? This is the pointy teeth that's just behind your tooth. First of all, in front, you have two incisors, or sort of blade-like that you use to cut with, and then there's a pointed tooth there, that is your canine. So these had long canines. Did I get everything on that? Yeah. Okay, now, one of these, during the Mesozoic, many of them went extinct. Okay, first of all, I said that synapsid lineage in the late Paleozoic they were the big guys. They were the main predators, they were the main herbivores on land. Most of them went extinct at the end of the Paleozoic, and they were replaced by this other lineage which dominated all throughout the Mesozoic. Some of these did survive, but they were very, very small all throughout the Mesozoic. In fact, in the early Triassic, the first that we can recognize as mammals happened to occur belonging to this lineage. And the mammals remained small and nocturnal, and most of them lived underground. Okay, they were probably eaten by dinosaurs and other reptiles. Okay, so that's one branch. We'll come back to that as when we talk about mammals. So this will lead to mammals. The sauropsid side. Okay, that's an A. So the scientific name is Sauropsida. It is the rest of the amulets. And they were dominant during the Mesozoic. Many of the groups went extinct, but the survivors are birds, crocodiles, turtles, snakes, lizards. A group that we call reptilia. Okay, so reptiles includes birds, because if we take the birds out, as used to be the case, then reptilia is paraphyletic. Okay, birds are definitely monophyletic, but what we call reptiles, snakes, crocodiles, lizards, turtles by themselves, without the birds, they would be paraphyletic. So the birds are reptiles. However, they're very highly derived reptiles. So this particular lineage, they have aglandular skin. Okay, that's an apomorphic. It means that the skin doesn't have sweat glands, oil glands, or very other types of glands. Whereas way down here, these fish and also the sauropsids, they do have glandular skin, okay? So the ancestral condition was to have glands. So we still have them. We have sebaceous glands, we have sweat glands, all embedded in our skin. But these guys don't have those types of skin. I'll have this as two different apomorphies, even though I have it up here as one. But this presence of keratin B is also an apomorphy for this group. Keratin, we have keratin. Our hair is almost pure keratin, but there's two different categories of keratin. One called keratin A, another called keratin B. Now, these guys have keratin A and B, okay? But it's keratin B is mostly found in skin, scales, and bird feathers. That's almost completely keratin B. We only have keratin A, okay? And this prevents water loss. Another apomorphy here, it has to do with the lower jaw. In early amniotes, the jaw is made up of several bones in here. Humans, mammals, a lot of those bones have fused, and we just only have one major bone called the dentary or mandible. But in reptiles even today, including birds, as well as early amniotes, there were several bones here. But one thing that is in this lineage on the inside of the mouth, of the lower jaw, is something called a coronoid. And that is not present in the synapsid lineage. So this is also an apomorphy for this in the lower jaw. Okay. Now within the synapsids, or sauropsids, everyone have this because I'm going to remove it. I'll let you come up and take a picture before I go on. I'll wait till the cameras go down. One camera's still up. Okay. And I will stand here if you want another picture as your representative synapsid. Okay. All right. So I'll start with amniota. Diapsid. Okay. Now this diapsids, they are, if we go back to the skull, in the temporal region, what they have as an apomorphy is two temporal fenestra. There's a lateral, or it's a lower temporal fenestra, and an upper temporal fenestra. Usually this is showing it here, but it's usually up on the top. So this major difference here then a lot of times between the synapsids and sauropsids. Well, early sauropsids had this type of skull, an apsid skull. There was no fenestra here. But later in the diapsida, they produce two fenestra, whereas synapsids have just one. Okay? And this has been in a lot of groups, it has been this skull bones, they have fused. In some cases, you can't find those anymore. Some of them have been lost, but at least in the ancestral state, from fossils that we know that we have it. Okay, now, Diapsida, for our purposes, we're going to call it reptilia. So, because it does include crown group reptilia, so all living reptiles belong to the Diapsida. Technically, there is a difference between Diapsida and reptilia if we take into consideration fossils that are now extinct. But for us, we're just going to go ahead and call, you can use either word, Diapsida or reptilia, meaning the same thing. Now, what's the difference between Diapsida and Sarapsida? Once again, if we take into account some extinct groups here, these two are different. But if all we had was just the living organisms today, these would be the same. But I still want to separate Sarapsida from Diapsida in this class. Okay? So this includes all living reptiles, and as I said, we're going to use these two words, they're equivalent to each other. And this is the amniote phylogeny from your textbook. What I've been talking about here is synapsids. The only synapsids living today are mammals, but we did have other groups here that have gone extinct. Likewise, amniotic egg. Here it says scales with hard keratin. That is keratin B, okay? They have both keratin A and keratin B, but that's what they're referring to in this figure. And this we call, of course, Sarapsida reptilia. Two branches, Lepidosauria and Archelosauria. And we'll go on through that. Okay, so without the birds, as I already mentioned, this particular clade is paraphyletic, but we're putting birds back into it because from the phylogeny, this is exactly where they fit in. And so two clades here, Lepidosauria, Archelosauria. Lepidosauria first. These are the snakes, lizards, and the tuatara. Okay, that although it looks like a lizard, it is something a little bit different. But mostly snakes and lizards. Ancestors of snakes had legs. Okay, they lost their legs. In fact, there's still some snakes that in the pelvic region, they still have remnant bones there, although they're non-functional. These guys shed their skin. Okay, that's an apomorphy. That means that this isn't the same as a cuticle. This is the epidermis. Remember that the epidermis in these groups is hard scales made out of keratin B, and that is easily replaced, and so they will completely lose their skin, and it will be left behind as an exuvium of some sort, and they will produce new skin. So that's something that's in here, paired hemipenes. The males have two penises, okay? And they use them both during mating because the vaginal opening for, or cloacal opening for reproduction in this group has two different entry places. So that's something unique. And tongue, which is mostly used for chemosensory functions, smell, basically. They're picking up chemical signals from the environment. It is notched, forked, and increase its surface area for absorbing chemicals from the environment. So here we have plenty of things that can belong to this. So this has snakes, lizards, and everyone knows what these things are, I'm sure. The other branch contains the rest of the reptiles. This is the Archelosauria. The only thing I'm going to say here for it, because this is a little bit hard to come up with a good apomorphy based on morphology, is that there's over 100 different places in their genome, in their DNA, 100 different places that are highly, highly conserved. And that's all I'm going to say, because it's most of the time the DNA mutates and the DNA sequences are not so identical, but here there's hardly any mutations in these 100 different, corresponding to 100 different sequences. Highly conserved, And the groups in here, turtles, you don't have to know the name Testudines. You can just only call them turtles. And they're really highly modified. One thing is that they have a skull that is anabsent. No temporal fenestra. This led to the idea before that probably these turtles probably belonged way down here because they were anabsent. Okay, having the temporal fenestra arose right here, so they thought the turtles belonged down here. But with DNA evidence, they actually belonged way up in the tree. Therefore, it must have lost the fenestra. They also have some other real weird aspects here as well. Is they have bone on the outside of the epidermis. Bone outside of the epidermis. And there's a shell up here, this is bone, carapace, and underneath it's called plastron. And then their legs are sticking out here. Their ribs are really strange because the ribs are fused to the inside of the shell. And it's hard to see how they ever developed like that. So there's plenty of apomorphs for this particular group. Turtles. And then, yes?
Can I ask a question? So for the 100 ultra-preserved elements of the genome, you're saying that it implies that every species in this clade has the same sequences for that?
Yeah, all these, we can find pretty much the same gene sequences in all amniotes. Yeah, and in fact, not in all amniotes, we can even go further down, gnathostomes. They all have the same genes, okay? But there's been gene duplications along the way, okay? So that some groups will have extra copies that have diverged. They're obviously gene duplications, and they will diverge. They have a little bit different sequence, a little bit different function as well, but still pretty much the same genes are in common. Okay, but these are highly conserved in their base sequence, these 100 sequences here. Okay, so now the big group is Argosauria. Okay, notice that this has an E and an L in there. By the time you get up into this area, there's a lot of names that look very, very similar to each other because they're just using Greek and Latin roots and rearranging them and everything. But this is the Archosaurs. Archosauria. Big group. That includes the birds. Crocodiles. The only living ones, Archosaurs today, are crocodiles and birds. Yes.
I have a question for the previous slide. You said bone outside the epidermis. Does that apply to the second apomorphism?
So go back. What?
You said that there's bone outside the epidermis. Does that apply?
Yeah, that plastron and carapace, that's bone.
So if we wrote that on the exams as carapace and plastron, is that wrong?
Oh, you're trying to cut down the words you have to learn, huh? Yeah, you can do that. I'll let you do that. Okay, because these are fancy words, plastron. Okay, I put in dinosaurs because everyone likes dinosaurs, right? Okay, we have to look at them. They were a big group of archosaurs. One apomorphy here, which their teeth are set in sockets. Let's go ahead and erase that one. Okay, let's forget about that one because that's not really a real major one. Forget it, forget it. They have a 4-chambered heart, okay? All these other amniotes down here, turtles and so forth, they have a 2-chambered heart. Now, this 4-chambered heart has evolved twice from an amniote pattern, okay? Here they have 2 atria, 2 ventricles. Mammals also have a 4-chambered heart. But when we get to the circulatory system, I'm going to show you that the 4-chambered heart, at least some of the blood vessels around the heart in archosaurs versus mammals indicate a difference. They still came from a common 3-chambered heart, and they still have a lot of commonality there, but this 4 chambers has evolved twice, independently of each other. All right, so on the jaws, these are real big things here, actually in the skull. They have 2 other openings in the skull, one of them in the lower jaw. It's called the mandibular fenestra. And fenestra, once again, is an open space in the bone, a window in the bone. In front of the eyes, there is another opening, which is called the antorbital fenestra. And so if we look at this picture right here, this is the eye. Here is the lower temporal fenestra, the upper temporal fenestra, because they have 2. In front of the eye, there's an opening in the bone here. Lacrimal is in the back, and well, don't worry about those bones. But that opening is called the antorbital fenestra. The orbital is called, the eye opening is called an orbital, okay? Anti means in front of. So this is in front of the eye opening. Its function, even today, don't really understand it. It could be lessening the weight of the skull, but we're not sure. Even though we have living representatives that have this, no one's really figured it out. On the lower jaw, once again, there's several bones here at the junction of what is called the surangular, angular, and dentary. There's another opening here, and it's called the mandibular fenestra. Okay, mandibular fenestra, that's true of all archosaurs, birds and crocodiles that we have today. Okay, and to see this a little bit better, you think this is a dinosaur? It isn't. Okay, it is an archosaur. It's something that was the main predator in the middle Mesozoic. They probably ate dinosaurs. The dinosaurs at that time were about this big. They weren't big at all. They weren't major. This is called a Rauisuchian, and they're all extinct, but I thought it was rather cute, so I took a picture of it. That's not included, okay? That's this guy. And so here is the antorbital fenestra, and the mandibular fenestra is right there, okay? These guys went extinct. These are more closely related to crocodiles. They belong on that lineage. All right, so that in Archosauria, there's 2 major branches. We always like 2s. 2 branches. Crocodilomorpha and Dinosauria. And so now you don't have to, I revised these slides from what I originally put up. So throw away the old version and use the new version. You don't have to know all this. Okay, I made this for another project just to show what how extensive once upon a time the Archosaurs used to be. Okay, so this is all Archosauria. And the crocodilomorphs are, the crocodiles and their relatives are the only survivors of this group here called Pseudotsuchia. You don't need to know Pseudotsuchia. Right now I'm giving you a free show. Okay, free show, won't go on any exam. You can watch me as if you're watching TV. Okay, you don't have to memorize any of this. I'll tell you what you need to know a little bit later. But nonetheless, in the early Triassic, mid-Triassic, these were the dominant critters in the land, something called phytosaurs, Rauisuchians, and episaurs, but at the end of the Triassic, they all went extinct. There were dinosaurs at that time, but they were very, very small, only no bigger than a small pony, okay? And so these other guys were much, much bigger, and they probably ate the dinosaurs. But nonetheless, after the end of the Triassic, these guys went extinct because there was massive volcanic eruptions, mostly as Africa and North America started drifting apart. Okay, there was a lot of activity, and this created a bad enough atmosphere that probably affected their ecology, and they disappeared. Going into the next period, the Jurassic, that's when these guys really took off. So we've seen this quite a bit of times, that we have certain organisms that are dominant, there's a mass extinction, and the survivors belong to a totally different clade, will then respond and evolve. And that happens many, many times. So in the Dinosauria, I really brought it up here just to let you see what real dinosaurs are. I only want you to know really 3 branches of Dinosauria, that's all. One of them, Ornithischia, and you don't need to know, I have apomorphes here, but you don't need to know them, okay? Except for the Dinosauria, which I'm going to talk about their apomorphes later. But 3 major groups of dinosaurs include the Ornithischia, Sauropodomorpha, and Theropoda. These are the only 3 I want you to know. These 2, Sauropoda and Theropoda, they belong to a branch called Saurischia. But I just want you to know these 3, okay? And some of the critters that happen to be in the Ornithischia, all of these happen to be herbivorous. There's no carnivores in there at all. And it includes stegosaurs, ankylosaurs, ceratopsians. There's a bunch of those. These guys are really abundant. So like Triceratops, Camelsaurus, and a few other things like that. That belongs to Ornithischia. Sauropodomorpha became the biggest animals ever. When they started, they're recognizable in the early, or in the mid-Triassic, but sauropods were about the size of a little pony. Okay, they weren't big, but later, toward the end of the Mesozoic, they have become huge, the largest animals that we've ever seen. Okay, these have very long necks, sauropods, and I'll show some pictures of them. Theropods, mostly carnivorous, and they retain, actually the theropods contain a lot of ancestral characters that the very, very earliest dinosaurs had, okay? And then they became more elaborate, but this includes something called spinosaurs, carnosaurs. Carnosaurs include Allosaurus, probably you're familiar with that, and this Silosauria. This here is a big group that I haven't expanded out, but in here is where you have the Tyrannosauroids and something called Maniraptorans. Maniraptorans have become very reduced in size, and some of them are about the size of a sparrow, okay? Some of them live in trees. Some of them evolved into birds. And so this is where the birds come from, okay? And I'll come back to the birds here in a moment. But this here is for free. You don't have to know that. This is what, okay, these things are not dinosaurs, okay? You probably, in your childhood, in the books that you've read, child books on dinosaurs, they usually get it all wrong, okay? That is not a dinosaur. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs, but they're closely related. They are archosaurs. Go back to this phylogeny, and pterosaurs right here. They're on the same lineage as the dinosaurs, separate from the crocodiles. Okay, but this, and they are highly, highly, highly evolved. And these things, they're not dinosaurs. Some of these are not even closely related to dinosaurs at all. Dinosaurs are a very special group, okay? And you have a set of very special apomorphies. One is that you have erect limbs. And I'm a little bit cheating here because there's some Mesozoic forms from Argentina and also from Ghost Ranch, New Mexico, that they found that are real small critters that also have erect limbs, but they're not dinosaurs, but they're stem dinosaurs. What do I mean by erect limbs? If you look at a lizard, turtle, they all have their legs sprawled out to the side. Okay, they run, and this is one of the reasons with that stance that running and breathing at the same time is a problem, okay? Because in order to run with small legs like this, how do fish swim? Beating their body back and forth like that. Well, that's still retained with a lot of terrestrial vertebrates. The lizards, they will still twist back and forth like that when they run. And that makes it very hard to breathe at the same time. So with erect limbs is that the limbs are vertical, straight down, and it frees walking and breathing, okay? They're not, furthermore, this type of stance is meant for speed. They can move, they can really move compared to a sprawled stance. That is evolved in amniotes twice, in the Dinosauria and in the mammal lineage as well. Another diagnostic feature is in the pelvic girdle. Okay, there's 3 bones that make up the pelvis. Ischium, ilium, pubis. I'll show this here picture. So I'm talking about this area right here where the leg, the femur, happens to fit in. In most animals, amniotes, the articulation with the pelvis, pelvic region, pelvic girdle, is a ball and socket type of thing. Because on the femur, you have a femur head, which is round, and then formed between the ilium, which is articulated with the backbone. Okay, that's articulated with the backbone. So it's called a pubis and an ischium. This is where the socket is. This is where the ball of the femur fits. Now, in other amniotes, this is not an open hole. It's a socket, a cup-like bone. So that's filled in with a bone. And the head of the femur fits in that. Okay, and this is how it moves. And there's a lot of different ways of motions. But in dinosaurs, that is perforated. There is no bone right there. It's just an open space. But this is where the head of the femur fits in there. Okay? So that is an apomorphic for the dinosaurs, and it is related to speed. Going the wrong direction here. Because the head of the femur, instead of being a round ball that fits in the acetabulum, it is barrel-shaped. And therefore, and also the head of the femur is almost 90 degrees to the shaft of the femur. So that when this barrel-shaped head of the femur fits in the acetabulum, the only motion is forward and backward. Unlike us, we can move our legs to the side. Okay, dinosaurs could not. It was straight forward and straight back, which is built for speed. Built for speed. The earliest dinosaurs were real fast runners. And the earliest dinosaurs were bipedal. They did not walk on the front legs. Their front legs had long claws. They used the claws to grab things. Some, as the dinosaurs, certain groups of dinosaurs increased in size, they secondarily became quadrupedal. But the earliest fossils of all dinosaurs, of all 3 lineages, are bipedal. Okay? Even the sauropods. Because the sauropods are small, and they walked on their back legs. Okay, now these things I do want you to know. Okay, because apomorphies for the dinosaur. And this is the only part of the phylogeny that I want you to know. And I'm not giving any apomorphies for these groups, but I do want you to know that they exist. These are herbivores. Popular ones that you know about are like Triceratops, Hadrosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, stegosaurs, and so forth. Sauropodomorphs, they're the big sauropods, and I'll show some pictures of them. Theropods, many of them are carnivorous. However, some of the later ones become omnivorous. Some of them become plant eaters.
Do we need to have it memorized that the last 2 are connected to another group, or?
Yeah, these 4 names, I think that's good. Because most books, you'll see a distinction between Ornithischia and Saurisschia. They usually make a big deal out of that. But Saurisschia includes both of those groups. And birds come from here. Okay? All right. So just some pictures. These are Ornithischians. And they're rather late stage ornithischians, except for this iguanodon. Notice that it is bipedal. All right, this is one of the earlier ones. These others, their ancestors were bipedal. They walked on their back legs. Even when these have been, as they've increased in size, however, they become secondarily quadrupedal. And you can still see that in the shape of their legs, because the back legs are much bigger than the forelimbs happen to be. So these are ornithischians, sauropodomorphs. This thing was so big, I had to get really far away to photograph that. It's in the Field Museum in Chicago. This is the largest animal, land animal, ever known. Okay, it's from Argentina. It's called Patagotitan, and it's about, from head to tail, about, I think it's 84 feet long, or something like that. And you can see for scale, that's human, right there, okay? This is from, okay, that looks like that's, yeah, this is Diplodocus. That was also a late sauropod from North America. And I think that was in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Okay, so these are sauropods, and these are various pictures of various types of tetrapods. So these are the real dinosaurs. Bird, okay, belongs here too. Okay, so those are the groups. And so let's talk about the one surviving group of dinosaurs, Aviala. So here we have Ornithischia, Sauriscia, sauropod, I'll abbreviate that, Theropida, and out of the Theropida, there's a bunch of things here, is Aviala. These are the birds, okay? And birds, they are the only living dinosaurs. So they are descended by evolutionary descent from dinosaurs, and many of the, if we didn't have any knowledge of fossils, if all we had were birds today, crocodiles, the birds have a lot of really specialized features. However, many of those features are not apomorphies of birds. They're apomorphies of some groups of dinosaurs because they started further back. So our oldest bird is a Jurassic bird. It's the only Jurassic bird there is. During the Cretaceous, however, there are many groups of birds, most of which had teeth, most of which had claws and on their wings. Most of those, well, they're all extinct, okay, but they still belong to the Avialis. So Archaeopteryx, we already talked about it. Now, many of these characters that we see in birds, for example, honeycomb bones, okay? We have solid bones. In the interior of our bones, it's filled with marrow, okay? Other types of tissues. And our bones are relatively heavy. These are very light because they're hollow, but yet they're strong, okay? Furthermore, part of their respiratory system is included inside those bones. Okay, they have very different types of lungs than what we have. They have feathers. Now these are modified. All feathers are made of keratin B. Okay, and they are modified reptilian scales. And really, there's many different types. So this honeycomb bone is true of most theropods. T-Rex had hollow bones. Okay, and furthermore, feathers. This may go back all the way to all dinosaurs and maybe even pterosaurs. They have found one pterosaur that has filamentous types of covering, and it's probably a primitive type of feather. And feathers are not just the tenacious feathers that you normally think of when you think of a feather, and I'll say more about that a little bit later. They have lungs that have one-way flow of air. unlike our lungs. Our lungs, we breathe it in, we breathe it out. And there's problems with that. And when we get into the physiology part, talk about how lungs work, I'll explain what the problem is. But with these guys, they have incredibly efficient lungs. The air moves in one direction. It doesn't have to be reversed. Crocodiles also have one-way flow. However, they don't have these elaborate air sacs that are also included in their bones. But nonetheless, this must go back. One-way airflow is probably an archosaurian feature, because crocodiles have it too. They have a wishbone, okay? You've all seen it when you've eaten turkey, okay? That is actually the fusion of clavicles. So this bone, the collarbone, those clavicles are fused together in birds, but in many theropods, they're fused together too. So it goes further back in time. A group that is called, part of the theropod clade that's called Neotheropoda. They have a furcula. You just need to call it a wishbone. I'll be happy about that. And feet with 4 toes. However, the only tracks are 3. So you've seen bird tracks, right? 3. Okay? 3 toes that are touching the ground. Most theropods were like that too. In fact, theropod trackways, you see bird-like feet. In fact, back in the 1820s, when they first came across a dinosaur trackway, they thought it was a big bird, a real big bird, okay? So this comes from theropods. And also reduction of number of fingers and toes. Now this is true of many theropods as well, okay? As I've already said, the foot has 3 toes that touch the ground, but even in the hand, they oftentimes only have 3 fingers as well. And you see that in bird wings as well, okay? To a certain extent, it's modified. So all these features that are highly associated with birds actually go way back into the dinosaurs. Feathers are what you mostly look at. However, feathers come in many different forms, even in modern birds. Some of these are just hair-like things. You can see it. Some of them down happen to have a highly branched pieces like that. You find that on the chest of birds, mostly for thermal regulation. Others are pennaceous. Okay, that's put that word up there because it's a fancy word. Okay, and they have 2 sides to it. There's a central axis and then barbs that are coming out, and they're all in a flat plane. These are called veins, V-A-N-E. Stage 4, the veins are very, very close together, and they're cross-linked by barbs, and then asymmetrical veins. This is what you find on modern birds on their wings. So when I say that there's feathers in dinosaurs, a lot of them are just this, nothing fancy, okay? Others are just like that. But it's in one group of theropods up here called maniraptorans, which are closest to the birds, that they have these types of feathers, okay? And they're all made of keratin. Now obviously, the earliest dinosaurs that had feathers were not flying. And so what did these things evolve for? What were their function? Even in modern birds, the function of feathers is variable. Not just only for flight, but they use it for display. And so many of the dinosaurs, we know that their feathers were colored, okay? Because we can find pigments in them, okay? Something called melanosomes. So they probably use it for display. This is an artist's conception of, this is a maniraptoran, an early one. They only had feathers on the wings and tail. They didn't have feathers anywhere else. Now, I want to point out that finding feathers in fossils is rare. Finding any sort of soft tissues is rare. But there are, in northeast China, called the Biol biota. It's a very great place for fossils that preserve a lot of soft tissues, and this is where we get most of our information from. This is something called Anchiornis from East Asia, and we even know the coloration of the feathers. We have hundreds of those fossils in northeast China. This is about the size of a crow, and it did not fly. It may have glided, but it did not fly, and it is not a bird. Okay, it is not a bird. All right, so insulation. Okay, modern birds, that's exactly what a lot of those feathers are for, is for insulation. Now this implies something about dinosaurs where they, cold-blooded. If you have insulation, you must be warm-blooded. Okay, that's only associated with maintaining a constant body temperature. Camouflage, coloration, and then flight. So these features all go back to birds, but now what are the apomorphies of the real birds today? They're these three things. Normal dinosaurs had a long, bony tail, but this has been reduced to what is called piggle style in birds. The fused bones of the lower backbone. There's feathers that haven't come off of there. They have bones in the hand that are fused, forming what is called a carpal metacarpus, and that's what's shown here in red. 3 fingers here, thumb, and there's a finger, there's a finger. Okay, this is a fusion between a finger bone and a wrist bone. This is what the carpal metacarpus is. If you chew on your chicken, pay attention to this next time you eat chicken, okay? And something called the lula. That's on their wing. It is associated with this piece here that represents the thumb. This is movable, and it has special feathers on it that allows, when the bird is taking off or landing, that it allows it to control its wings much, much better. Mesozoic birds, such as Archaeopteryx and a bunch of others, do not have that. So this is actually apomorphic for another group within the Amnion, but I'm going to count it here as that. Some other features here, this is where I'll stop, is that endothermic. Okay, that means that they maintain that their source of heat is metabolic, and they are also homeothermic, meaning that they maintain a constant body temperature, what we call warm-blooded. And so many theropod dinosaurs were this also. And that type is maintaining a high body temperature is expensive metabolically, but it is also allows the animal to do much more activities. In contrast to snakes, turtles, which are ectothermic, where their body heat comes from outside, so they run into the sunlight, into the shade to maintain body temperature. Poikilothermic is that their body temperature changes. It is not held constant. Acute vision, birds can really see well. If you're flying, you want to have good vision. If you run into a tree,